All right, so on this occasion, we are continuing the series we began last week, which is the Parsha in Halacha, in which I look through the literature, the corpus of shuls and shuvas in particular, to see which halachic discussions sort of hinge on, revolve around pasukim in this week's Parsha, and the more surprising, the more unexpected, the more points. And I think the case we have this week, the instance we have this week, will definitely be worth a lot of points, because this is actually one of the premises. The premise here is that there is a hidden, secret lav, a loisase, in this week's Parsha that no one has written about, that's not counted in the Sifrei Meinei HaMitzvahs, but a very prominent early Achron wanted to taina that this is actually a lav in the Torah. That's one premise. As we'll see, there are other angles here as well. Let's just begin, I guess, with the pasukim in the Parsha. So in this week's Parsha, Parsha's Pinchas, Parak Chav Zayin, towards the end, you have this segment there where Moshe turns to Hashem and says, Yifkod Hashem alikei haruchos l'chol basar isha la'eda, which itself is actually a very interesting lashon. Hashem alikei haruchos l'chol basar. We have it only twice in Tanakh, once in Parshas Balak and once here. In each place, Rashi gives a taich, but beyond the taich, there's the question of what is this interesting lashon, but that's not our focus here today. So Yifkad Hashem l'kei haruchos, there should be an ish al ha'eda. Asher yetzel lefneihem, asher yovel lefneihem, asher yetziyem, asher yeviyem. So we need someone to go before them, to come before them, to take them out, to bring them in. Also interesting l'shaynus. And the plea concludes, the petition concludes, and may Hashem's congregation should not be left like sheep without a shepherd. Also interesting lashon. It's always interesting to notice when there are more poetic lashonis in the Torah, or in this case, sort of an analogy, a mashal. Also, sort of interesting to see in the Torah. Again, not really our focus here, but it's always interesting to look at the text as text and to see what's interesting about it. Anyways, that's Moshe's petition to Hashem, which is also interesting more generally, that Moshe is taking this initiative and turning to Hashem with this request. So, and it continues, pasuk Yitches, Yutes, Chav, Chav Aleph, Chav Beis, Chav Gimel, Vayas Moshe kasher tziva Hashem Moshe, v'yikachas Yeshua, Yismech es yadav alav. So that's this chelik in the sixth parsha. If you had to break down the Parsha in the old sense of a paragraph in the Torah with a psucha and a stuma. So this is one of the interesting parshiyos sheb Parshas Pinchas. But I want to focus in particular on this lashon of v'lo siyeh das Hashem katsoin asher ein lahem raya. If you take a look at Targum Yonasan, nothing major, but the Targum Yonasan sort of spells it out a bit more. V'lo sihi kenishta de Hashem v'lo chakimen. The pasuk just sort of says it as a mashal. That's Hashem katzon asher ein lahem raya. They shouldn't be like sheep. So Targum Yonasan sort of fleshes out the analogy. The Kanishta da Hashem, the Adas Hashem, the congregation of Hashem should not be left below Chakimin, without wise men, without Chachamim. Min beglal de la yitun beni amamaya, so that they should not go astray among the nations. Ka'ana, like sheep, and it goes on with the analogy that the sheep without a shepherd. Now, perhaps some of us may remember, I don't know if it's completely widespread, but in yeshiva, in cheder, sometimes there were those who would joke that v'hayisa meshuga mimari enecha, from the klalos and the teichecha, so there would be those who would joke that v'hayisa meshuga is a mitzvah semen HaTorah, is a mitzvah say to be meshuga. So essentially, wherever the Torah has this construction of v'hayisa or v'lo siyeh, you have sort of the potential to say that perhaps this is a tzivah of the Torah. So as we shall see, there is in fact a makar that wanted a taina, that the pasuk v'leisiyah das Hashem katzoin asher ein lahem raya, the construction of that sentence indicates that this is actually a loisase, a lav, that it's aser for Adas Hashem to remain katsoin asher ein lahem raya. And that essentially brings us to the topic of whether there is a chiyuv, whether there is an inyan, whether there is a lav, a loisase, in the sense of, in the context of a community having a rav versus not having a rav. Is there a chiyuv to have a rav? Is there a loisase not to have a rav, not to have a chacham, not to have someone leading the community? And as we'll see, in addition to the premise that this is an interesting taich to taich the pasuk this way, as we'll see, the question itself is actually more complicated than you might expect. So our focus here, the major central makar of our discussion, is a tshuva of Maharitatz. Who is Maharitatz? Maharitatz stands for Reb Yom Tov Tzahalon. Not to be confused, Maharitatz with Maharit. In this case, we add this, technically it could have been called Maharitz, I guess, but his name is Yom Tov, so Yom Tov Tzahalon, Maharitatz. Interestingly, they seem to, I don't know if they knew each other, they certainly seem to have overlapped. They were both Chachamim in Tzfas, maybe Maharit was a generation earlier, so Maharitatz was a Chacham in Tzfas, he was born in 1559, he passed away in the year 1618, Shin Yutes to Shinayin Tes. I guess by the time he reached adulthood, it would have maybe perhaps been taka more like a dor after the Maharit, but pretty close to the famous dor of Chacham Mitzvahs, and he came from a Sephardic family. We're not going to delve too deeply into his biography here. He's certainly someone who I've quoted before in other shiurim. Not going to start listing and enumerating them. So when it comes to Maharitatz, though, there is a Sefer Shalos Chuvas that was printed, maybe not B'chayav, but close to Samach L'chayav, maybe in the Tufts, if I'm not mistaken. But there was apparently another manuscript that had additional Shalos Chuvas. You would have to look in the Mavoi to the editions to see what the story there is, the two different sources, the two different manuscripts, the two different collections of Chuvas. But there was another collection of his Chuvas, and those Chuvas, which are now known as Shalos Chuvas Maharitatz HaChadashos, were only printed in the last few decades. And maybe a bit later we'll get into the exact timeline or chronology, because it's Nageya, but it's just Nageya to mention that right now, because what Maharitatz is about to say, as we'll see, a very fascinating vort based on this pasuk in this week's Parsha, but it feels sort of a shame that this was only printed in the last few decades, because I feel that if it had been printed b'shaitoi, then all the achronim would have probably quoted it, or probably would have had what to say about it, it would have enriched the discussion. As we'll see, there are other makairis, other makairis on this topic that we'll touch on, and will be an overview of. So it would have been more geschmack to see how other achronim would have responded to this vort of his. Apparently it's a very out-of-the-box lateral vort, and he's the only one who thought of it, and so we don't see that others thought of it independently, and therefore it wasn't discussed. But I can imagine someone like the Chassam Sofer and other major achronim could probably have had a geschmack time with the vort, as we shall see. But let's not be marich in introductions, especially since we haven't gotten to the inyan itself. Let's jump into it. So in Shut, Maharitatz HaChadashos, Siman Kuf Lamed Gimel. Today you can find it both in the first time it was printed in by Machon Yerushalayim, Maharitatz HaChadashos, but also more recently, Machon Zichron Aaron, we did the Maharitatz, and they did both the Yishanos and the Chadashos. So you can find all these chuvas both from Machon Yerushalayim at an earlier stage. It doesn't, Machon Yerushalayim has gotten more advanced over time. So when you look at it, you see it's one of the earlier works. And so you have that, and you have Zichron Aaron, whichever you prefer. Both have some measure of ha'aris on the chuvas as well, explaining certain words, being with sign certain siyunim. So this tshuva begins, Yikablu kahal kodesh shiu es tshuvasam asher shalu. So let the kahila of shiu receive the tshuva to what they asked. What is shiu? So in the Machon Yerushalayim edition, maybe not this tshuva, maybe an earlier tshuva, but their Metzayin shiu refers to the Greek island of Chios. Now, I'm not confident that I'm pronouncing it correctly. There may be various pronunciations, but that's what I'm going to go with on this occasion. You can look up Chios, Chios. You can find it on Wikipedia. It's the 5th largest Greek island, 10th largest island in the Mediterranean Sea. It's actually very close to Turkey. It's known for its exports of mastic gum. It has medieval villages. Those are one of its tourist attractions, etc. If you look at the Hebrew Wikipedia, so the way it's spelled in Ivrit in Hebrew today is chios, chaf yud vav samach. I think I saw within the Maritat itself that there was an alternate spelling that was closer to this or like this. If you look up chios on Hebrew Wikipedia, you'll see they have a section, as Hebrew Wikipedia often does, on the Jewish history of this island. And interestingly, apparently, Josephus, Yosef ben Matasio, writes that Hordus ended up at this island at some point in the year 14 BCE, or somewhere around there. We know that Hordus and his family actually had interesting roles throughout the Roman Empire, not just in Judea. I didn't look up the exact details, exact history of why Hordus would have ended up there, but it's not so surprising. It seems like he was acting as a high-ranking Roman official in that capacity. There is some evidence of early Jewish presence on the island, which they get into, and there's some archaeology there. But then, further along, interestingly, Benjamin of Tudela mentions that there were Jews there who followed the Romaniyot rite, not Ashkenazim, not Sephardim, but followed the old Greek rite. There's a tradition that the Rabbi Yaakov Menashe the Balaturim was probably traveling to Eretz Yisrael, but passed away on the way, and was on this very island. And there was a caver on the island that was said to be the caver of the Balaturim. I think I've run into that trivia fact in the context of looking up the Torah, the Balaturim, but here coming at it from the other angle, from the angle of the island itself. At some point, it was part of the Republic of Genoa in Italy. As we know, Italy controlled different islands, different parts of Greek territories, or perhaps even what would be considered today Turkish territories during that era, whether Genoa or Venice. And often those Italian connections brought Jews to these areas. There were Jews who sometimes would split their time between Greek islands, Greek territories, and spending time on the Italian mainland, etc. And so there was a Jewish presence closer to the time that we're talking about. So we have, perhaps after a break, but there was a shul established on the island in 1457. And you had Italian Jews or Sephardic Jews, and so that gives us sort of the context for this interaction between the people here on Chios or Shio, or however you want to pronounce it, reaching out to Maharitats in Svas. It probably suggests that they were Sephardim or had Sephardi links, and would be reaching out to one of the leaders of the Sephardic community worldwide, then in Svas being the Maharitats. So that's a bit of the context and background, I suppose. So the people of Shio reached out to him, and they asked, "Im koifim b'nei ha'ir zeh zeh lahavi lahem chacham b'schar l'freish lahem al pi Hashem u'lahafrish oisam me'isura u'loichicham b'mili d'shmaya." Whether the locals, the people in the city, in this case of Shio, in this Greek island, can force each other to lay out money to bring a chacham, to he uses different lishonos to teach them Hashem's word, and to keep them away from prohibited things, and to give them techacha, rebuke. So those are sort of the three roles of the chacham, at least as presented here. Why are they asking? Because clearly, because not everyone is on board. There are those who are refusing. They're mesarvim, mekablim moros. They're not accepting the authority, and they don't wish to part with their hard-earned money, their funds, to contribute towards bringing a chacham, shoiter, umoishel. So there's a sort of a question here, or perhaps a double question here. The fundamental question, as we'll see, is there a chiyuv to bring a chacham, to hire a chacham, and to pay for a chacham? The secondary part of that question is whether we are koifim to bring a chacham. Today, if we were to ask the question, we would likely ask it more in the more abstract sense of whether there's a chiyuv. But back then, these types of questions would have been posed with a focus on whether we are koifim, which was the more common term, the more common concept back then, where they had organized kehillas. Perhaps I've definitely mentioned this in various shiurim before. I don't know if in the latest series of recordings or not, but it's very important in order to understand the history of Judaism, of Yiddishkeit, of organized Judaism. You have to understand that Jewish communities were highly organized entities until not too long ago. Today, it's mostly an entirely different model where everyone is sort of free to do what they want, and that leads to a lot of gaps. People talk about the power of Beis Din, whether it's the question of gittin, acrimonious divorces, and many other matters, whether mominous, didei Torah. A lot of the trouble, a lot of the dysfunction that people talk about today is sort of failing to acknowledge this fundamental difference, this fundamental change, in that once upon a time, there was a central entity of the Kehillah that had very strong control over the members of the Kehillah, and they had the power to force members of the Kehillah to do various things, which had its own milos and chesronos. Obviously, that's power that could be abused, but the Torah, the Poskim, the Sifrei Halacha, fundamentally are working with the assumption that this power exists. So much of what you learn on these topics is working under the assumption that this power exists. And yet, in the last 100, 150, 200 years, we know that the European governments undermined the power of the Kehillah. We know the European governments eliminated the cherem. The cherem was one of the powerful tools of the Kehillah to enforce various matters. So they undermined the cherem, they undermined the power of the Kehillah in other ways. Whenever the Kehillah tried to crack down on someone, whether rightfully or not, that person could run to the authorities. And in the last 200 years, the authorities tended more and more to intervene until they sort of undermined the Kehillah's power to do anything to begin with. It was also often, let's say in Russia, you had the government undermining the power of the traditional Rav and installing a Rav Mitam, so sort of a parallel power structure. So much happened, and then moving to America, moving to the West, or living in Western countries where you don't really need to belong to a Kehillah at all in the modern era. You're sort of a citizen of your country first and foremost, and your participation in the Kehillah is perhaps more secondary. So these are major shifts, and to the extent that I would say that the entire Yiddishkeit today is almost a different Yiddishkeit than it was 200 years ago and before. And yet, this doesn't get acknowledged often enough. If you can have a discussion about X, Y, and Z, you want to say, how are we going about anything that has to do with the power that would require the essential power of a Beis Din, of a Kehillah? If you don't acknowledge this major fact, then you can't really have an intelligent conversation about what is going on. So in that context, when you have an organized Kehillah, when you have that power, so there's this power of kofeh. Big element of the organized Kehillah was the taxes, and that's also sort of invisible to most people today. Most people today don't really think about that too much, or that how much that played a part in the Jewish Kehillah. We know that in Poland in the 1800s, the meat tax was a major issue, and the other taxes as well, the candle tax and other stuff. Even speaking for myself, until I fully realized and appreciated the historic significance and the significance for Havana of understanding so many things, this is the kind of thing where you sort of tune it out. This is stuff that they had once upon a time. It's not that doesn't relate to how we live our lives today. You sort of tune it out unless you realize how important it actually is to Havana. So again, in this case, bring the conversation back around to the topic at hand. When you ask whether there is an inyan or there's a chiyuv, so primarily the question is whether there's a concept of kofeh, if there's an entity of a Kehillah, and that entity of the Kehillah can impose taxes and can collect funds using its power against the will of perhaps individuals or even many individuals. So now the shaila is, can you apply that power of kofeh to force the Kehillah to raise the funds necessary to hire a Rav, to bring a Rav, a Chacham, whatever you want to call it? That is fundamentally the question here. And you see that that's the language right from the beginning. Shalu im kofeh b'nei ha'ir zeh lahavi lahem Chacham b'schar. So as we'll see, this is what the Maritatz's tshuvas are about. Later we'll see we'll do a quick overview of other tshuvas that touched on this over the centuries. And the key word in these discussions is always the word kofeh. Now, although the focus is on kofeh, which I said today is less of a factor, and today we would speak more in the abstract as to whether there's a chiyuv. But fundamentally, from the discussion that we'll see here and elsewhere, we have to sort of also pay attention and notice that if this is such a big question, we have to ask, why is this such a big question? There is clearly, fundamentally, some kind of mystery here, we could say, as to whether halacha truly does have a chiyuv to have a rav, to hire a rav. If it was clear, if it was obvious, if it was straightforward, we wouldn't find Maharitats writing this tshuva that we're about to see. We wouldn't see the other Makaritas later making the arguments that they make. There is clearly something that I'm not saying it's an active conscious cover-up. That's not the right term here. But these discussions are sort of compensating for a lack, an absence, a void. There is something missing from the record on this seemingly very important or even basic question. I would assume most people would assume that if asked without context, they would assume probably is a chiyuv. Obviously, when it comes to your own individual shul, every individual semi-kahila today was asked whether they have to hire a real rav. Maybe their answer would be different, but which we'll get to as well, the more modern discussions of this question. But in the abstract, everyone would sort of agree that, yeah, you probably have to have a rav, probably have to have a chacham. Maybe they would argue that not every shul needs one. It's enough to have access to one more generally, more locally, or maybe today, as we'll see, some eventually, maybe even internationally, 6 out of 7 days a week, you can reach anyone, contact anyone, anywhere. So the application might be debated, but everyone would seemingly concede that there probably is a chiyuv. But yet, as we'll see, there's no clear makar on the record in the early Sfarim, and as we'll see, Maritats and others are protesting, as the famous English expression goes, to protest too much. They're sort of protesting and like I said, compensating for the fact that there is something missing here from the record. So that's by way of hakdama and framing to keep this in mind as we're going along. Obviously, it's not fully ever stated in the tshuva. You can read the tshuva without noticing and realizing what exactly is going on here, but we try to go one step above and to give you the correct framing. So this was the question they asked from Shio in Greece. Is there a chiyuv? Can there be kofeh to bring a chacham? Zogt the Maritats says, interesting that you ask, because you're not the only ones asking. People keep on asking this question. So so this question is coming from far and wide. He's in Tzfas, so Greece is to the west. He's getting the question from the west, but he's also getting the question from the other end of, perhaps you could say, his sphere, the area of his sway, from Anna in Bavel in the east. And I wrote a long tshuva to them as well. And that tshuva has reached us as well. It's tshuva samach in Maritat Chadashis, but we won't look at it here because it doesn't touch on this pasuk from this Parsha. But he does mention, and as we'll see, there's another tshuva later, and then in that tshuva he mentions these previous tshuvas, the one to Anna, the one here. So he keeps on referencing these shuls and tshuvas to each other and saying, oh yeah, they keep on asking me. Now, this is not our focus here. We're focusing more on the shiloh from Shio, but since he mentioned Anna in Bavel, that itself was interesting to me. For more on the Kahila and Anna, see the essay also printed separately, Tshuvas LeKahilas Anna by Meir Ben Yohu, printed in Tafshin Yud Aleph. I think selected from the same Ksav Yad, probably. I think it's Tshuvas of Maritats, and it's probably from the same Ksav Yad. Interestingly, I saw in a number of places that the community in Anna had a tradition that they were actually the site of Naharda, the city of Naharda, mentioned in Gemara as one of the important Jewish cities of Chachamim in Bavel, B'zman HaMirayim. And generally, it's always interesting, if you think about Jewish communities geographically, so Bavel is an interesting place where you sort of seemingly stop hearing much about Chachamim and Kehilas and Bavel. Somewhere after the 1100s, the 1200s, B'zman Rambam, you still had Shmuel ben Ali in Baghdad, or Rosh Hashiva, Hamshich to the yeshivas of the Goinim in Bavel, which moved to Baghdad. And at some point, that seems to have really petered out. Obviously, you would have to also be familiar with the economic history and other factors more generally to understand whether the Jews could have been thriving or not in those places at that time. And then later we have this renaissance with the Menashe Klein and his rabbi, but it sort of goes back, doesn't go back too far past, the 1700s. So it's interesting to see that there's these details about the Skehila of Anna in Bavel in the 1500s, and they're in communication with Mari Tats. There is an article on Anna on Wikipedia in English, but I did not see one in Hebrew. But of course, it's possible to poke around and find more on the topic. At any rate, so it's interesting. He's writing to the Yidden in Greece, in this island in Greece, and saying, "Hey, I actually got this question from Anna in Bavel, and I wrote a long shuva to them," which we do have, as I said. Not only that, he says, I actually got the same question from you. Gam the malaschem eshtekad, to your greatness, your highness, I also responded to this last year. And he mentions the name of Avram Dibuton, that he was involved in the question and answer on that occasion. And I've responded to this question in the context of other shilas. It keeps on coming up over and over and over again. So that itself is an interesting observation Mari Tats is making, that this seems to be a hot button topic, an important issue during that era, and people keep asking about it. If we had to go back and think about Jewish communities scattered through the world in the last 1,000 years, it seems reasonable to assume that the more prominent ones, the more well-to-do economically, had Rabbanim, had Chachamim, but it's very possible if you actually start, usually when we look at that history, we sort of look at it through the lens of Rabbanim. So we look at a Kehillah in the context of our interest in the local Chacham, the local Rav, the local Mechaber. But if you look at the history of communities just purely through whatever it is, records, economic records, and other things, you may start noticing that there are many Kehillas throughout the world that are known to have a presence, but they don't necessarily have a well-known Chacham or aren't known to have a Chacham at all. So this would have been a fairly common question for many Kehillas, many places where there was some organized Jewish community, but maybe they were too small, or maybe at some point they got bigger, but no one felt like shelling out the money. So this was a common question. And so you already asked me last year, and I responded to you, and that this tshuva we don't seem to have. Neither of the new editions are mitzayin to anything on this passage. But he says, it seems like, he seems to be saying that I responded to you last year, and you're asking again. So it seems like you weren't convinced from the rayas that I brought last time, to bring a chacham manig, and that the greater a chacham he is, so this is time for take two, round two. I'm going to shiva yadai or yadi shenis. I'm going to try my hand again to bring additional rayas atzumois midivri apaiskim u'mimedrash chachamim u'bimikroi kodesh. And he mentions three sources here. It's going to be paiskim, medrash chacham, chazal, and bimikroi kodesh from psukim, as we'll see. That's the premise. That's why we're focusing here, because he's going to bring a very interesting raya from psukim. But he begins with trying to bring a raya from the Rambam. He wants to tie out that the Rambam actually does say there's a chiyuv to have a chacham. Where does the Rambam say this? So he found interesting Rambam. The Rambam is in Hilchos Tshuva, Parak Dalet, and it's talking about the importance of Tshuva and those for whom Tshuva is closed. So in that context, Dr. Rambam, Lefichach tzarech lahamid b'chol kol v'kol miyisrael, chacham gadol v'zaken v'yirei shemayim and u'urav v'ohuv lahem k'dei sheyehei merchiach l'rabim u'machzer oisam b'tshuva. You need to have a chacham, which he defines as chacham gadol, zaken v'yirei shemayim, ohuv lahem, to be a merchiach and to be machzer them b'tshuva. You'll notice earlier also when they asked the question of kofeh and bnei yir, they mentioned three things: lifresh lem al pi Hashem, lahafish oisam yisur, u'lei chicham b'mili d'shmaya, to be a merchiach. That was seen as one of the three pillars of the Chacham's job, of the Rav's job. So here in Hilchos Tshuva, the Rambam says that every kahal needs to have a Chacham Gadol, a Zaken, etc., to be mechiach l'rabim u'machzor oisam b'tshuva ad kan l'shoyin harambam. Zok the Maritat harei hadover mefurish. It's clear. He said, tzarech lahamid b'chol kol Yisrael Chacham Gadol mil d'shmaya. What does tzarech mean? It says tzarech is mashma shekoifen Allah shu tzarech v'zeh pashat. He says it's pashat. If I may say it, it's not so pashat. I think he's again trying to overstate his case and shut down debate. But objectively, that's an interesting raya to bring. Certainly, the Rambam has to be discussed and evaluated. But the Rambam is talking in the context of tshuva, to have mechiach, and it doesn't say that you should hire him to answer tshuvas to be marhira. It says specifically that there should be someone to be mechiach. It's not clear that it's a full-time job. It's not clear that there's payment involved. So therefore, if there's no payment involved, then there's no kofeh involved. But Maritatz is seeing it through this lens, and perhaps already through a certain construct that was widespread at the time. So to him, it's pashut that if the Rambam says you need to have a chacham gadol, the middle of the shmaya, that means that you need to have a rav and you need to pay for the rav. So tzarech means kofeh, and that's what he meant when he advertised these as being rayas and sumos from the divrei poskim. That's basically it. That's the raya from the divrei poskim. He says zois va'oid. Now we're going to go on to the mikroi kodesh umi medrash chachamim. And here comes the interesting raya from this week's Parsha. He says, "Tzei lamad maksiv Menashe Rabbeinu olav shalom she'omar yifked Hashem lekeiruchas l'cholbas yishal le'eda she'etz lefneim begoymer v'leisiya adas Hashem katsoyin asher ein lehem roya." That's the Mikroi Kodesh. And what's the Medrash Chacham? So there's a Chazal and a Sifri. I looked it up. It may be Sifri Zutta, but maybe I have that wrong. At any rate, the Chazal, there's a Sifri. It's quoted in Yalkut, Parshas Vayelech, so it's not the Yalkut Shemoini on this week's Parsha, but the Yalkut in Parshas Vayelech. And in Yalkut Vayelech, it also says, Kra es Yehoshua. So the Sifri, the Yalkut there, focusing on that pasuk, sort of rewinds to this Parsha of Moshe intervening and being the one responsible for Yeshua's appointment. So state there, and this is the Lashon as he quotes it from Yalkut as it was printed for Sedition. Meishav Moshe lefnei Kadosh Baruch Hu Ribono shel Olam Hoyel v'ani nifter min ha'olam b'nesoyen gadol. Interesting Lashon, which we'll talk about. Har'eni adam ne'amon sheyamed al Yisrael asher eitzei yedeihen l'shalom. Another interesting Lashon which he talks about. V'cheinu omer asher yetze lefneihem v'yomer Hashem al Moshe kach l'chas Yeshua ben Nun. And the Medrash continues and says there were chapters in Jewish history, Arba Malchias, Moshe B'Yisrael, V'ein B'em Chacham, V'ein B'em Tzadik, B'mei Achav, B'mei Yeshafat, Hayo Yisrael Nefaitzim Halaharim, Katsoin Asher Ein Lehem Roya. I didn't go look it up, but it sounds like it's quoting another pasuk, perhaps from Navi, and perhaps that pasuk also uses the lashon Katsoin Asher Ein Lehem Roya. So maybe it's a bit of a tushta, a tzadashava, that they were Katsoin Asher Ein Lehem Roya. They didn't have a Chacham and a Tzadik. And the Medrash, the Yalkut continues. And then he gets sort of very deep, sort of goes off for like half the tshuva here to sort of discuss and analyze the Medrash, the Lashonis HaMedrash, the meaning of the Medrash. That's not so much our focus here, and I don't see why that discussion, mamish, impacts our Havana later on. So I'll just summarize just some highlights. He has a discussion on the Lashon B'Nisayan Gadol. What's Lashon B'Nisayan? And he interestingly says that L'chayr Nisayan doesn't mean the Nisayan in the common sense, in the usual sense, but it means Lashon anger. And we find that the word Zoyafim in the Torah is translated Nesisin. So there's this Aramaic Shirish Nesisin, Lashon anger. So B'Nisayan Gadol must be Lashon Nesisin. And he says, I didn't have time to look in the Sifri. He's quoting from the Yalkut. He says, I didn't have a chance to look in the Sifri to see maybe in the Makar in the Sifri there's another Nusach. And it's interesting to come across this, because I actually just came across this Maritatz a few weeks ago. From this angle, I was Parsha Shlach. I was looking into the word Vayinasu in Parsha Shlach. And Vayinasu, there's also Lashon Nisayan. That's how we would understand it. However, there are many Mekayros in the Rishonim in France, and even Rashi in other places, that seem to teach Vayinasu, not Lashon Nisayan in the usual sense, but Takim Lashon Kas. And what's the makar? What's the raya? The big raya they always quote is Zoyafim Lashon Nesisin. So at that time I was looking for those who quote this Targum Zoyafim Lashon Nesisin, and the Maritatz also came up. So I had encountered this there and then from this angle. Interestingly, there is actually Yalkut Shemoini Maduras Meister of Cook, where they use Kisvei Yad and they comment on the Nusach. And Taka there, Maritatz said he didn't have a chance to look it up, but their Nusach in this line here, instead of B'Nisayan Gadol, is actually B'Nesis Gadol. And they're Mitzayin there that, in Fusidishin, it says B'Nisayan, and in the Sifri, there's like another word there that looks like a shibush. And the shibush there seems to be of this word in the Ksav Yad, B'Nesis Gadol. So that mamish supports the Maritatz's assumption that B'Nisayan was Lashon Nesisin, because in fact, in the Ksav Yad, the Lashon is B'Nesis. So this is sort of a rare word in Lashon Chazal, but it's being used here. So that's one linguistic aspect. And the Maritatz goes into the background. The Moshe kept on begging Hashem first to be saved. V'eschanan, it doesn't mention V'eschanan, but we know V'eschanan, Moshe begged Hashem. And then after Hashem, it was clear that Hashem said no, so then Moshe is sort of pivoting to his next request, which is also sort of a taina to be alive, and sort of saying, you can't take me out of this world unless I have a replacement. Ad boy chalifasi. Who is this Adam Neman Shiyamin al Yisrael Sher Etz Yudein L'Shalom? And then here he gets into that lashon. What's the pshat in that lashon? Interestingly, in the Yakut Shemaini Maduras Messenger of Cook, the nusach is Yotzei Yedein L'Shalom instead of Eitzei Yedein L'Shalom, which is close to the nusach, the Hagah that Maritatz suggests here. And so we're going to be Mekatze here. We're not going to go through his Purushim, his Taichin to the Medrash, but overall, the point of the Medrash certainly is to sort of spell out that Moshe said that I can't go from this world unless there's someone who can stand in my stead, be in my place, and it has to be a gvarton. The lashon there is a gvarton, to be strong, to be able to be oimid b'peretz. So he's sort of using this medrash as his springboard to spell out that you always need to have a chacham, b'novein, ladrichim, lalamdam, and otherwise you're concerned she'ein lehem raya. And as we see, there were tkufas where the Yidden were described as Katsana She'en Lahem Raya. The Taka didn't have a Chacham, the Taka didn't have a leader. So we can't allow this to happen. We can't allow them to come to this matzav Katsana She'en Lahem Raya. So this medrash is sort of a vehicle for expressing this in a more expressive way. And after he finishes teaching up the medrash, he comes back around and he says, "Ken lamadu mikan kama hechrich." So we see that just as Moshe saw this importance and he brought it up to Hashem to say, you can't take me from this world unless you have a replacement for me. So we see that there's a hechrich. You need a chacham, la'adricham, la'afrisham yisur, and you need a navoin, la'hitzidavim b'terdavar, la'landam sefer pilpul. You need these characteristics. All these characteristics are important, both the hadracha and both being taka alamdan, to be able to teach them. And here's where he comes to this chiddush, this taich here, talking this week's parsha. And it seems very likely to me to say, "Shekol Eida v'Kol mi Yisrael she'ein memanan aleim chacham anovim she'yeh chacham gadol k'mei shekasef harambam." Back to that Rambam Menashe Klein, which is his big marker, his big yisoyin. Any kehila doesn't appoint one. Harehu ke over belav. So they're being over on a lav. So the pasuk says, that Hashem's congregation should not be like sheep without a shepherd. So it says, so we have to teach it like it's a leisa, like a lav. And now it's talking part of Moshe Rabbeinu's kavana. He's not just speaking to Hashem. He's sort of speaking out loud to Hashem for us to hear, for us to listen. Lahazir es Yisrael, it's taka azhara, shliyu katsoyin asher ein lahem roya. So that's the taina, and okay, it's a little funny. You're going to teach a pasuk like that, be mechadash alav. So zok the maritat aveira from Chazal that we teach pasukim like this, because there's another pasuk of loyia. Tzei lamad, it's a lashon likes to use. Tzei lamad Chazal. Take another pasuk of the Parsha earlier. B'loyia kekoirach. It says you shouldn't be like koirach. So Amru b'Gemara, kol hamachzik b'machleikas over b'lav shenemar v'leiyeh kakoirach. Whoever fears a machleikas, keeps a machleikas going, is over on a lav, because it says v'leiyeh kakoirach. Now, in the context there in the pasuk, it's stam. Hashem is saying that let's not have this happen again. Let's not have a repeat. Let's not have a repetition of kairach. But the Gemara says that v'leiyeh kakoirach, that language, that linguistic construct, suggests that there's a lav aleisasa kol hamachzik b'machleikas over b'lav shenemar v'leiyeh kakoirach. In fact, if you want to look it up, you'll if you Google Ovadia Yosef, you'll see that Wikipedia comes up at the top. There's actually an entry on Wikipedia for the Hebrew Wikipedia for the lav, the Isser of Ovadia Yosef, the Gemara, and that Gemara is actually quoted in the Rif and the Rosh. So speaking happens to be Derech Hagav, in contrast to our topic here of hiring a rav and a chacham, which we'll see is not stated in the Sifrei HaPoskim really. Dafke, which is often a Gemara, is taka quoted in some chashuv svarim, and it's even quoted among some of the Meinei Mitzvahs, the Bahag, Shait Shuva, Smag. However, the Rambam taka doesn't count it, and he writes clearly that the drasha is just an asmachta. And when the Rambam discusses Leisus Goy to do, he mentions this the drasha, but it says it's just a drasha. And it's not a tzivu, it's just an iyum, it's just a threat that if you try repeating what Kairach did, what happened to Kairach will also be repeated. So the Rambam is very clear that he does not hold that it's a lav, but the Gemara does say it, and many Sfarim quoted it or understood it to be some kind of lav. So we can touch adas Hashem in the same way. Kol ve'edam Yisrael shein soichrin u'mevin aleim chacham v'noven she'yeh chacham gadol b'chacham v'yeh escheit hava lehu ka'ivrim belav v'leisi adas Hashem katzoin asher ein lahem roya. And again, just like he said before, the Rambam says v'zeh poshet. First, it's a chiddush karev be'enai loymar ke over, and then he says v'zeh poshet the mavur. But we see that after Moshe begged not to die, as he explicated earlier, and it didn't help. So the only thing he could taina was that I can't leave the world until I can see a replacement. Otherwise, I can't die. So that sort of shows you the power of this argument, the force of this argument. That this was his final card, his final ace, was to say that, okay, maybe it's time for me to go, but I can't go unless there is a replacement, and that was taka seen as a gerechte taina to the extent that Hashem had to respond to it. Hashem didn't have an answer to shut it down. Instead, Hashem had to acquiesce and taka find a replacement. So that's a very powerful point that he's uncovering here in this in the subtext of this parsha, this chapter here in this week's parsha. So the same would apply for every community. Not back then it was all Klal Yisrael. Here we're talking about individual communities, but the same principle should apply. You have to hire and pay a chacham zaken yirei shemayim u'ma'ayin v'noven u'meiti davar mitech davar l'lamdam sefer. Interestingly, that I noticed that in both editions there is actually a period and a paragraph break after the words v'zeh pashat u'mavayer, and l'chaira that is simply incorrect. And in my file, I changed the text that it's one. Period. Etc. That's how I think the text should be read. So that's minor ha'ara. Sometimes you see these interesting, what seem to be mistakes in the printed editions. I guess it would be interesting to see how it appears in the Ksav Yad. But even then, unless it's an autographed Ksav Yad, I could be masik on the Ksav Yad as well, if absolutely necessary. And with that, it concludes, and if you follow what I say, then your community should do well, and everything should be great. And here goes the signature. Interestingly, this is not the only place in Maritat. Well, as Maritat said earlier, people kept on asking him this question, and he kept on referencing his previous shuvas, or the previous times people asked the question. So this actually happened again. A few semanim later, in Siman Kuf Samach Aleph, he receives a shayla from a community. I did not see that there's any indication which community it is, even though he's sort of alluding to their location and the community's character in the tshuva, but I did not see, maybe I missed something, maybe it's in a mavoi, an introduction somewhere, but I don't know which community it is. And here they had a more specific, like a more intricate question, which he also alluded to earlier. That sometimes it was a straightforward question, Ari Mechuyev Kofeh, and sometimes it was like a subsection of a larger question. So here you have the question they asked that they had Mo'ez Shel Kodesh. I think later he uses also the form Hekdesh. They had money that's meant for a good cause, and they would invest the money, as was the case at that time, especially in Sephardic communities. There were hektish funds, and the hektish funds were invested. Perhaps they lent them beribis. Maybe this more of a heter to lend those beribis, as is discussed in Hilchos Ribis. At any rate, there were payers. The money had a return, and they used the return. They would use funds from the return to pay a sach yedua, to pay a set amount to the malamdim for the aniyim and the yisayimim. So, stamazoi, fathers mechuyev to teach us on Torah, so the individuals pay for the malamdim in this community. But there was moed shel kodesh shel hekdesh, which whose the return was used to fund a set amount for the malamdim for the aniyim and the yisayimim. And now, punkt. Lucky them, there are no yisayimim and no aniyim. Wow, what a time to be alive. There are no yisayimim or aniyim. So the money is just sitting there. So at the community meeting, some people brought up the idea and they said, hey, usually the money is meant to be used for the Yisayim Mananiyim. There are no Yisayim Mananiyim. So let's pay the Schar Malamdim for those who are not Yisayim Mananiyim. Let's use the money for that. Right now, there's no Aniyim. That was what some suggested. Others suggested that you're not Nitzrachim, which Amal was a more common term, was even used in Yiddish. Nitzrachim, we're not Nitzrachim. You're not needy. So why shouldn't you continue paying the malamdim from your pocket? Why should you use moed shel hekdesh? What should we do with the moed shel kodesh shel hekdesh? Let them sit and keep on generating a return. It's nothing urgent. Let them make more money. And then we can use the money instead. Liskor lem chacham marbitz Torah bakol. Let's use the money instead. We direct it to hire a chacham, a marbitz Torah, because right now we don't have a marbitz Torah. It was interesting for me to run into this question because I was just speaking to someone who's in the tchum of chinuch, and today the question of spending money on tuition and using tzedakah money for tuition, individual tzedakah money. Here we're talking about klal tzedakah money. For whom, which level, which tier, are you a nitzrach, are you not a nitzrach? Today tuition also contains more than just paying malamdim. So this is a big topic today. So it's always interesting to actually go back in history and see variations of these types of questions back in the day. This is almost 500 years ago, a little less. So this is one such question. At any rate, so this was the argument they had. Should we just pay the schar malamdim for every man, or should we use it to hire a chacham marbitz Torah? And they also mentioned that maybe there's another source of funds. There were other funds that they raised to adorn the Sefer Torah, interestingly. And that Sha'ar HaKol, the Sha'ar HaKol, there's the Miktas on Sha'ar HaKol that want to spend the money on themselves to pay their malamdim bills. The Sha'ar HaKol that said we should use the money to hire Chacham Marbitz Torah said, hey, let's use this other money for the Sefer Torah, to adorn the Sefer Torah, and not use that for that, and instead put it together with the moed shel kodesh shel hekdesh, the aniyim yisayim money, and then invest all of that, and we'll pay this kulam once all of that money comes together. Then there'll be a dover hagun, then there'll be a nice amount to hire a chacham hagun sheyarbitz Torah v'yodim es haderech yechuba v'samaisa asher yasum. It's also interesting to sort of note and analyze the finances, the amount of money. It sounds like if they let the money sit for a while, plus they take this other money and let that sit for a while, then they'll have enough to hire a chacham versus the amount that they were able to spend for malamdim for the aniyim and the yisayim. Sounds like it's a totally different financial league. But obviously we don't have the exact numbers here. At any rate, that was their question. So it seems here the nusach, the lashon of the shaila of the kehillah was preserved, but the name of the kehillah is omitted. Answers the maritats, and for the maritats. People keep asking me this. I was just asked about this again from Anna and Babel. Here he says Anna near Baghdad. Meir Shio. Here the word Shio, the shin has an apostrophe after it, so to show you that it's more like Chio. And from Chio, whether Koifim B'nei Eir says Elohavilem Marbitz Torah. And I wrote Barucha Barayas Brutus Mendivi Harambam that you have to hire Marbitz Torah. And so he's summarizing sort of certainly the latest shuvah from Shio, which we saw before. So I quoted the Rambam, and I also wrote Kamesad of Badavar, those who resist, Kamat Oiver Balav. He keeps on throwing in these words, Kamat Oiver Balav V'leisi Adas Hashem Katzon Asher Ein Lehem Roya. And I made the tzushtel to kol hamachziv v'machleikas over balav v'liyeh kekairach. So gam anu noimar kol hameneim alav itam l'chacham marbitz Torah v'leisi adas Hashem katzon asher ein lehem roya. And I quoted a maimer, a statement from Sifri, ve'harachti hemakti ve'erchavti. I analyzed the maimer of the Sifri. Halohi ksuva b'chelik hashlishi sheli be'at shuvas. It's in the third chelik of my shuvas, which perhaps that's what now is known as maritats ha-chadoshes. But interesting that he alludes to how they were divided in his files. And now the maritats adds an interesting detail. He says, Vimkein, me'ata kal v'chaymer advarim. That's what I wrote to Anna and to Shio. But he writes to these people who are not named, he says, don't think you're like Anna and Shio. Anna and Shio, Anna and Bava, Shio in Greece, Im Baratzahim, Asher Ein Peretz, Ve'ein Yoitzis, Kasamnikain. Those are places that have chachamim. They weren't devoid of Torah. They weren't amaratzim. They had chacham. They just didn't have an official chacham arbitz Torah. So Mikol Shekain v'Kal V'Chomer be'Eretz Halezu Asher Shal Hashoel. So Kal V'Chomer, to you guys, you're the ones asking now, because I see that your community has many Bali Ziraya. There are a lot of violent people, people who strong arm other people, not such easygoing, friendly, nice guys. And he mentions, I got another shayla from you guys that also suggests that this is how you guys do business, go about things. So you guys actually have an ongoing problem. You guys are, meaning also previously when he says ein peretz v'yaitis, could be he means less in terms of whether or not they have chachamim, but maybe more in the sense of they don't have an immediate emergency problem that needs intervention. When you see a community that has a problem, you say, okay, this community could really use a rav, a chacham right now, someone to set things straight. So those communities, they're fine, whatever. I don't know if he'll address the Torah question so much, or whether they have B'nai Torah or not. But as I'm saying it, I think the vart is more that they don't have an ongoing pirza right now. Right now, your community has a pirza. Your community has Bali Zraya. That's why you don't want to have a Ben Torah to tell you what to do. You don't want someone to set you straight. You want to be able to do whatever you want. So it's interesting, this observation, this sociological observation that he's making, that sometimes it's dumb, laziness, or whatever, people don't want to spend money, but at least they're behaving. Here, you guys are not behaving, and that's why you don't want a Rav to come and set you straight and tell you what to do. So that's why, dafka for your community, we need to force you in every which way possible to bring a marbitz Torah, and dafka someone who's liboy kalev ha'aryeh, someone who's up to the challenge, up to the task, to l'shaber malta'os avo, to break the sources of injustice that have taken root in your community. It says Nachter tzu, even the question itself, the way the question was posed, tells us tells us what type of group of chutzpahnikas that we have here. Because where on earth did you get this notion from? This miktas hakol, they want to take money for hektish, shehuktish l'talmud Torah sheyisayim ba'aniyim. So it's interesting. This is alluding to different communal institutions in the Sephardic world at that time. Mois hektish, Talmud Torah. So Talmud Torah for yisayim ba'aniyim. You have mois hektish. It was given, that was dedicated, it was set aside specifically for Talmud Torah yisayim ba'aniyim. And you thought that was even worth mentioning, worth bringing up, that perhaps we should spend it on your own children where the father is chayav? That would be avel, chamasu. That would be a crime. You'd literally be essentially embezzling those funds. And he throws in a shtickle klala. He says, if you spend the money of the assignment on your children, so you should be terrified that maybe what's going to end up happening is, you know what, your children will actually need the funds. The funds will make it so that they are going to the right cause, because they will become the children of Yisraelim. So, of course, you can't touch the money of the Yisraelim Aniyim, and that tells me how much you need a Rav to set you straight. Now, to your actual question as to whether you can use the money for the Yisraelim to bring a marbitz Torah, truth is, Ekel Kach Min HaRoish Yechalu Mois Hektish Yisraelim is really, this also should come from your pocket. This is something that you need to spend money on and not use stock of funds for. And everyone should pay. You gotta impose a tax that will fund the salary of the chacham, like everyone else does. You know, there's a normal model for it. You know what people do. You know the keilas work. And you're trying to be wise guys and try to figure out where you can grab the money from some other cause where the money is hektish. It's meant for a different cause, a cause that's tzedakah. And paying money towards the marbitz Torah isn't actually meant to be tzedakah money, right? So let's say in today's context, like I said, today people are always asking, can you tzedakah money for this? Can you tzedakah money for that? Back then we're talking about communal funds. Here today, the question is usually more commonly about individual tzedakah funds, meiser funds. So I guess if there was a community that had a mass for the Rav, so then I'm sure people would come and ask, can we spend our meiser money for the Rav? So the connotation here is that should be a mass, it should be its own thing. It's not, certainly shouldn't come from communal tzedakah funds. Then he says, however, if you don't see that happening, so you could change the direction, the cause of the money, which is its own geder and tzedakah, to be mashana from one cause to another. But b'shas adchak, of course, you can be mashana to bring a marbetz Torah, roivitz ka'ayu chalavi, lanatik agudas moito l'shaber zrayis rishoyim. But he keeps on emphasizing that the Rav's job is to break the evil, the injustice. It's not just to give shiurim. Because zuhi gedoyla mikol tzarkei ir, because this is the biggest need of all. When he pulls out the power they had back then of klalas, etc. They used to use these the power of shvua, the power of klala, the power of haskama. You have to give your word, or whatever exactly the application would be here. But we're pulling out all those words, all those concepts you're mechuyev to, like you said earlier, the kufim b'chol min kfiyas. Which I think it means he's again threatening them that if you don't do the right thing, then that will be the outcome. So it's also interesting to see how he invokes these types of threats and klalos in his halachic writing. It concludes with Shemay Elonu Yishkem Betach V'Olav Tavi Berchus Toy B'Tzur Yisrael Yisrael Mishkias V'Einu M'Torosoi Neflois Amein Koi Matir Hatzoir. So these are the two chiyuvos of the maritats that, like I said, unfortunately were only printed in the last few decades, so we weren't zeicha to see how the achronim would have taken it, what they would have done with it. But this is very interesting, and like I said, specifically the angle of using this week's Parsha as a makar. More generally, I'll mention it here, could have mentioned earlier or later, that it would be interesting actually to make a likut of all the places where we find later Svarim, well, I guess you could also count Chazal, but starting from Chazal, but certainly later as well, are there other examples, or what are the other examples of Shreinim Achreinim quoting pasukim in this way, where the pasuk clearly was not traditionally, officially understood as being a tzivui, but sort of deriving a type of tzivui from pasukim in this way. So that is the Maritats. Who, now that Maritats was printed, who quotes the Maritats? So I found two poskim in their chuvas who quote this Maritats in this vort. The first one is Ovadia Yosef, Shalos Chuvas Yabia Eimer. And as it turns out, the context in which he quotes it is its own interesting historical parsha. If you look in Yabia Eimer Chelik Zayin Yered Deya Sim Yudches, so there's a chuva from Bezer Shchedesh Cheshvan and Tav Shin Lamed Ches. And it's addressed to a fellow by the name of Gedalia Schreiber, yeshivish Hamoatza Hadatit Yerushalayim. We're not going to delve too deeply into the exact structure of how the politics in Yerushalayim worked, but as we'll see, it's negaya somewhat. But there is the Moatza Hadatit, sort of the religious committee, and the yeshivish Hamoatza Hadatit seem to have the authority to deal with the spiritual appointments of the community, and as we'll see specifically, the question of Rabbanim in Yerushalayim. So this is, let's first read what Ovadia Yosef himself writes in the letter. He's writing to Gedalia Schreiber, who has the position that's negaya to this the following question. He says, with regard to your question, Behiyot, that the Rashi Hamaflaga Hadatit Leumit, Rosh Tevis Bafdal, which was the big Mizrahi party in Israel at the time, who are outright, overt Zionists. Today, the term Dati Leumi is still very common, and that was the name of the party at the time, was Maflaga Datit Leumit, religious national party, Mafdal for short. So the leaders of Mafdal are placing great pressure on you, on you and on the other members of the committee, and they're demanding to stop the preparations for appointing Rabbanim Roshim in Yerushalayim. Mafdal is clashing, so it looks like the Moatzah Datit wants to have elections, and the Mafdal is intervening and placing great pressure to essentially stop and suspend the entire process right now. Why is that? Because the candidates that stand to be elected are not the candidates that the Mafdal leaders want. They're a little bit more, apparently they're more religious. Bavur hashkafatam hadatit she'ena to'emet l'ruach hamafdal. Their religious perspective doesn't fit with the spirit of the mafdal, despite their godless and Torah and Yiras Hashem Torah. So mafdal is placing this great pressure. So you, Ovadia Yosef, reached out to me, and you wish to receive a chavat dat halachtit, a halachic opinion, as to whether to submit to the pressure and to suspend the election, or to keep it up, to continue with the process for elections until they appoint rabbanim rashim for Yerushalayim b'poel. So this is actually a very interesting parsha. So we have to first give the context. This is 1977, October 1977, Cheshvan Tafshin Lamed Ches. At that time, Shlomo Goren was the Rabbi Rashi Ashkenazi, and Ovadia Yosef was the Rabbi Rashi Sephardi. And it seems that Shlomo Goren was pretty much 100% identified with the Mafdal, with that stream, with that strain, and Ovadia Yosef was more strongly identified with more traditional Haredi factions. And essentially what we find at that time, you can search it, you can see references to it on Wikipedia and other places, and you can look up the newspapers in the time. Essentially what happened was, Tzvi Pesach Frank had been the last Rabbi Rashi Ashkenazi of Yerushalayim. He had passed away in Tafshin Chaf Aleph, which was 15 years or more earlier at that time. And ever since then, there had been no replacement. There had been a Rav Rashi Sephardi, a Rav Pardes for a few years in the interim, but for much of the time there wasn't a Rav Rashi Sephardi either. And essentially that was the status quo. That was how things were going. It seems in part in the articles at the time, some said that Shlomo Goren enjoyed having the double authority of being the Rabbi Rashi for Israel, and sort of the questions of religion in Yerushalayim ended up coming to him as well. As Ovadia Yosef alludes to, though, the likely candidates would have been more Haredi. And as we'll see, Ovadia Yosef doesn't mention here, but gets mentioned later, the two candidates that stood to win, and in fact did win, were Rabbi Zolti for Rav Rashi Ashkenazi, and Rav Shalom Meshash, or Mesas, of Morocco, who actually lived in Morocco at the time, to be Rav Rashi Sephardi. Mesas, for sure, was more in Ovadia Yosef's corner, and Rav Shalom as well was certainly more Haredi than the Mafdal. He was not someone that the Mafdal and Shlomo Goren in particular would have liked. You look it up in Rabbi Zolti's Wikipedia, Hebrew Wikipedia, you'll see, first of all, Rav Zolti was a few years earlier, had been a prominent Rav going out against the Psak Din, Achva Achas of Shlomo Goren. And in fact, back then, the Shlomo Goren made sure that he did not get elected to the Moetzet Rabbanut Rashit. But now, at this time, in 1977, this issue of the Rabbanim Rashiyim in Yerushalayim came to a head. And in 1971, in addition to the Eda Haredis, which of course is doing its own thing, there actually had been this Haredi move to appoint unofficial Rabbanim Rashiyim of Yerushalayim. Rabbi Zolti was elected then, which probably hurt his case to then be accepted and be elected as the official government, local government, and government-sanctioned Rav. But during this Tkufa, October 1977, November 1977, ultimately in November, the elections were held, and Rav Zolti was elected with the involvement of Ovadia Yosef and Agudas Yisrael, and the Mafdal did manage to get someone to run against him. That was Rav Dov Lior, who was still with us, and Rav Goren supported him, but Rav Zolti won, and Rav Shalom Meshash, or Mesas, won as well. You could look it up on Rav Lior's entry as well. They mentioned that in Tafshin Lamed Ches, 1977, his Rebbeim, Rav Tzvi Yehuda Kook, Rav Shapiro, Shlomo Goren, convinced him to run against himself, Zolti, but he did not win. And Wikipedia has been cited a lot of articles from the time. You can also search directly in the National Library of Israel's newspapers archive and find many articles written at the time. You can also look up Reb Gedalia Schreiber. Gedalia Schreiber also has a Wikipedia entry. He actually passed away just a few years ago, Tafshin Pei Aleph, at an old age. And it says in 1973, he was asked to run the Moatzah Datit, and in the context, in the process of him having this leadership, it says he was involved in setting and erecting 50 shuls, 40 mikvahs, 24 Rabbanei Shchunot, and bringing back the Rabbanut HaRashit L'Yerushalayim by getting Rav Mitzal Zolti and Rav Shalom Mashash elected. Rav Mashash actually, like I said, came from Morocco to fill this tafkid, and ultimately both Rabban and Ovadia Yosef and Shlomo Goren ultimately blessed the outcome. I was looking through the articles and I saw that after Rav Zolti won, so even though Shlomo Goren really clearly did not care for him, but after he won, Shlomo Goren did the classy thing and sent a telegram congratulating him on his win. And they write there that, so that was surprising. The people were surprised that Shlomo Goren did that. And they say, unsurprisingly, anti-surprisingly, Yehuda the cook came out with a statement that Rav Zolti is a terrible person and all that. So interesting to see the dynamics and the politics at that time. It's neged to Havana in general. It's hard to justify knowing every single piece of politics, but it gives us insight into recent history. One article that I saw, maybe it was linked to Wikipedia, maybe I found it, is Ma'arechet HaBechirot HaMuch'eret Biyoter. It was a very, very unpleasant, very ugly election campaign. So that's some of the politics, some of the context there. And so in that context, Ovadia Yosef is writing this tshuva. So Ovadia Yosef, to write this tshuva, is going to lean very heavily on these types of mekayros, right? So Yerushalayim has a shtela for Rav Rashi, but the shtela isn't filled. So Vestetainen, maybe Yerushalayim doesn't need one. That's what people like Shlomo Goren and people in Mafdal seem to think, that if we can't get a Rav that we like, it's better not to have a Rav at all. Ovadia Yosef is going to make the case that it's pasuk, a chiyuv, it's pasuk, the urgent need, it must be a Rav. Obviously, he also supports the candidates that stand to be elected. So, it's not fully objective per se, but he's going to show that he has a lot of halachic mekayros on his side. That's what brought him to this sugya. So it's interesting to see this whole parsha, both the reality, the politics of it, and as we'll see now, the halacha of it. So he begins by quoting this Rosh. This is apparently a famous Rosh. Rosh and Tshuva, Klal Vav Siman Aleph, was asked by a community. There's a tzibur that cannot pay the salary for a Rav and a Shliach tzibur. It's either the Rav or the Shliach tzibur. So which should it be? You can only pick one. So the Rosh says it depends. If the Rav you have in mind is a Rav Muveh Gadol B'Torah Baki Beiro B'Dinim, then Talmud Torah comes first. And if not, then Shliach tzibur comes first. As we'll see in a moment, we have to clarify what we mean when we say Shliach tzibur. Doesn't mean stam chazan that can do chazanas, but it meant for real Shliach tzibur to be moitzi rav min echavas. We'll see in a second. He'll quote from Yaakov Emden, so I'm not going to say it myself. And he says v'chein nifsak la'alacha b'shulchan aruch erachayim siman und gimel sif chavdal. This Rosh. So he doesn't quote it, but I'll quote it. You look it up in erachayim and gimel chavdal. It says tzibur should tzirichin liskor rav shliach tzibur ve'im biyodem kadei schar shneim hu rav movak v'gad b'torah v'aki b'yiro hu kaidem. So this Rosh is brought la'alacha by the Mechaber Taka in this Siman and Sif. For Chabad, look it up in Alter Rebbe Shulchan Aruch Siman and Gimel Sif Lamed Aleph. He also cites this halacha. Tzibur should tzirich miskor rav v'shatz im b'yodem kadei sipik shneim im hu rav movek u'baki b'yiro hu kaidem l'shatz shetam terah kaidem l'korel memlav shatz kaidem kadei lahitzi harav midei chivasam. Back to Ovadia Yosef, he quotes this is Yaakov Emden in his Murdik Tzia, which is on Tur Eirachayim. In Murdik Tzia and Tur Eirachayim, Simnun Gimel, Dr. Yaakov Emden, that Bechlal, you have to understand the history and the Pshat. What does the Rosh mean when he says Shliach Tzibur? Hadavar Pasha, that was Dafka B'Yameim, where they needed a Shliach Tzibur, Pasha to be Moitzi, those who weren't Baki. Back then, not everyone knew how to daven, and it's also important to point out that back then, before the invention of printing, so it wasn't shaykh for everyone to have a siddur. Male, if everyone could have a siddur, then the bar falls much lower. As long as you can read, you can daven. Back then, even reading didn't necessarily mean that you could daven, because you didn't have a siddur in front of you, so you had to be baki in the whole tefillah bal peh. That's a talent, that's a challenge. Not everyone can do that. So Shliach Tzibur's job was literally still to be moitzi those who aren't baki. So when they asked the Rosh that, they didn't mean stam chazanas, they meant someone to help us lead the tefillahs. Otherwise, it's not. We don't always have someone, or whatever the case, whatever the mitzias was. So back then, that's why it was a shaila, and it was hard to say which one. So it depends on the rav. Now everyone can daven. No one's relying on the shliach tzibur. So avada, a rav, merira always comes first, even if he's not a gadol. The rosh only if he's a gadol. Dr. Yaakov Emden, even if he's not a gadol, she after the kol b'lei rav, the lav kliyam adina gemiri. I'm quoting from Ovadia Yosef, quoting Yaakov Emden. I think sometimes his quotes can be paraphrases, so I'm quoting it like it's a quote, but I'm pointing out that maybe it's not 100% an accurate quote, or it's paraphrased, or it's shortened. The lav kliyam adina gemiri kol misro muchrachem lias lahem meira hira v'rei tzen kadashim. So Yaakov Emden also makes the point that now everyone needs a meira hira. And of course, the Rav comes first. And when we say today to hire a chazan, we mean a chazan with a nice voice. A kol can survive without a chazan with a nice voice, but they can't survive without a meira hira, even if he's not a gadol. V'yiftach b'doirei harehu ka'abir sheba abirim. And then Rabbi Ovadia Yosef quotes a Mishnah Brura. There's a beer halacha. Apparently, it's a famous beer halacha. It's a beer halacha. It's not beer halacha. Often is being Isaac and Yonam Be'iyun, but here it's more of a drasha of the Chafetz Chaim, more of a kolkaida of the Chafetz Chaim. The beer halacha and Simon and Gimel Sif Chavdalad or Sifkat Chavdalad writes, Mikan yesh lumoid goydel achiv hamutul al kol ir ve'ir b'Yisrael limnois alef l'reisham rav meira hira asher yerdel hem b'mitzvus ha'torah mishpata lo'edim esaderech yelchu bo v'samayis asher yasun v'liyu ke'ivrim ha'megash Hashem ha'afela. And even back then, that meant that mitzvah tefillah would be nitchas legamre, because apparently the context was that without a shliach tzibur, maybe they couldn't daven. So it sounds like it wasn't just like we keep saying. Shliach tzibur was the difference between having a proper tefillah, proper minyan, proper tefillah, and not having one. And according to the Rosh, if you have a gadol or Rav Meira, a gadol, if that means choosing him over mitzvah tefillah, there's a chiyuv to prefer a Rav Meira. And kol shekain if they can daven themselves, like Rebbe Emden said. So mizeh zakter the Chafetz Chaim is a yimlu pachad veresas Rashi ayaris b'Yisrael she'ein lehem rav and made it tzedek be'iram. So he's going out with, like I said, a kolkaida. He's very clearly aiming at a real problem that he diagnosed, that he saw, that there are many kehilos with leadership, and they don't have a rav and made it tzedek, a rav and a matz, ovin gadolhu, and even if you have a sheikh rubaydik, you still need a made it tzedek, Hachas Shabbos, Yom Tov, Hachas Pesach, Hachas Nida, Tefillah b'mikveh, and all other dinim, and Seif Dover without a Rav and made it tzedek, Umanik, with Darkei Hashem, they'll end up with Chol Shabbos, Yom Tov, eating Yisurim, Chash Chametz, Oed Kami Yisuri Kresis. As we touched on a few shiurim recordings ago, we're speaking about the community of Bickerberg and Yaakov Emden, and how it sounded like they had what I said you could call a reverend. The Sefer and the Sheikhet also sort of did the Siddur Kedushin, like we saw in America. So this model clearly was a widespread model, both back in Europe and Smaller Kehilos, and certainly in America. And the Chafetz Chaim is calling it out, Bismanoi, and saying this is a terrible thing. And you have a Sheikh Rubaydik, you have a reverend, it's not enough. You need someone who can paskin in the big Shilas, Shabbos, Yom Tov, Pesach, Nida, Tefillah b'mikveh. And without a Rav and a Matz, it's going to be Chol Shabbos, etc. So again, I'll point out that the Maritatz seemingly was focused less on that. He seemed less concerned by that, maybe because all these communities had Chachamim, and he was more concerned about having the power, the heft, the force of a Rav to crack down on stuff that needs to be cracked down upon. Whereas the Mishnah Brura, Bir Halacha, is Parsha talking about the basic halacha, that without a Rav Meir that you don't have a Talmid Chacham who can answer Shilas, then you're in real trouble. So that's the Mishnah Brura, Bir Halacha. And then Ovadia Yosef quotes Taka Shut Mani Tatza Chadashes Chelik Beis and Minkuf Lamed Gimel, and he quotes the Mani Tatza Bekitzer Karav Bein Elema Shem Evnim Balav, and then he sort of quotes the Rambam Hilchos Shuvah afterwards, that you have this Rambam Hilchos Shuvah. So and Tzarech means Kaifen in the Rambam. So that's the Mani Tatza Bekitzer. He also is Mitzayin Chin Kosav Oidsham B'Simen Kuf Samach Aleph. And that's Ois Aleph in the Yabiyah Eimer. Then in Ois Beis, he quotes a bunch of other Makaitis and Paiskim, Sfardish Paiskim, who also essentially dealt with the same Shaila without bringing the same Raya. This is a tshuva from Marash Halevi, who also was dealing with this question. He says, Minui Marbetz Torah, even if only the Miut want to be Makayim this mitzvah, Yecholim Lakuf, as Arabim Hamayim, they can use Kfiyah. Just as we find in other contexts, the Kaifim B'nei Chotzer, Livnei Beis Shar. So there's sometimes the miyot can be kofeh for the roiv for things that are extremely important. So that would be the case here. Koshkin in the dan. Here you have Talmud Torah connected kulam. You need a Meir Tzedek. So that's Menashe Levi. The Hiskim Ima Hagohin Maharchash. The Maharchash agreed with him, and he said that Meneas Akol meaning Meir Tzedek Marbetz Torah chayiv nidu. If you stand in the way, chayiv nidu. You bring ma'akav the rabbis says mitzvah, and you have no greater mitzvah than Marbetz Torah. Lahiris Lamadar Chayishara. Again, it's interesting to make the distinction and see: are we talking about ikar paskening, or are we talking about being marbetz Torah teaching Torah to the rabbin? Back then, that would sort of be the yeshiva for the beyond the children in the Talmud Torah. You needed someone to be a marbetz Torah to teach Torah. That would have been the equivalent to a local yeshiva. So that could be the emphasis. You don't have that, so then you end up having a community of Amei Aretz and not Bnei Torah. So that could have been the greater concern in some cases. It's signed to Maharibal that you have a shvua das rabbim. So shvua das rabbim, usually you're not matter shvua das rabbim unless it's for a dvar mitzvah. But lahater limnis marbetz Torah in the mitzvah gdei lehiman. I didn't look up the context to see what was the shvua that was made of das rabbim, but that being appointing a marbetz Torah is a great mitzvah, and he's been signed to a few other such svardish achreinim. Then he's been signed to Hagarin of Avram Antabi. B'short more of a holus by the community that doesn't have the ability to pay for Rav Marbetz Torah and Hilchos Esav Hater, and so they made a haskama chamura ba'olo v'shvul b'cherem, using all those tools in their toolkit that they used to have to make a strong haskama that has to be enforced for them and those who come after them. Obama Chareim, Shemekana lahaba. All those who arrive in this city, whichever city it was, all those who come for business, so we're going to tax all visiting soichrim. They all have to give a certain percentage per 100 of either the money they brought or the money they spend or whatever it is. Kanohog be'aram tsoiva b'Damascus, as was already the practice in other places in Syria. This also sounds like it's from Syria. Again, I just didn't look it up. But this was the standard, right? We spoke earlier about taxing. You need to have a tax to pay the funds for the Rav's salary. So where's the tax coming from? Who are you taxing? So one oifen was to tax the arachim aborim lemischer. And people clearly have an incentive to come do business. So whoever comes, we'll tax them. And the term that they used for it was the jabila. That was the common term in the Arabic world for a tax. In fact, I've seen before the word jabila even made its way into Ashkenazi literature. Sometimes in Ashkenazi literature, they also called a communal tax the jabila. So they made a haskama that the seichel have to pay the jabila. If they refuse to pay the jabila, they have no rishos to do schayra, to do mischer in their community. So this haskama was made, and then the shaila was, is it taka a good haskama? Again, we're not looking up all these secondary sources. We're just relying on Ovadia Yosef's kitzer. So, Bavam had to be sure more of all is right. And even though Shepnei Moshe, he wrote that if they made a jabila and they were masking b'cherem, so sveika lahachmer, kasher sveika deiraisa. The shaila was apparently that the Seichim themselves felt that it was a Bal Karcham. It's a whole sugya that you would have to, I guess, delve into to understand the tzaddim. But so there was the shaila of whether the haskama was a legitimate haskama or not, or the Seichim could be moicha. So the Shepnei Moshe said that chayir sveika lahachmer, you don't want to mess with a chayrim. But Marik says that if the chayrim is Bal Karcham shel Seichim and the Seichim lemaisa don't keep it, that you don't have to punish them. It's not fair to punish them. They weren't parties to the haskama, to the tax. You made a chayim on yourselves to collect the tax, but the seichim aren't parties to it, so we can't punish them. The seichim should be chayshish la'atzmam, that they're being over on a chayim, but it doesn't rise to the level of using all the tools at our disposal to enforce the haskama and the chayim. So that's the Marik on the other hand, and the Pnei Safik Chere Meimetzim and a Muchzak, another mocker. These are big shilas that they had back then when this is how things worked. Zok the Morva Halas Bikumakum Dan, even those who say that you can't always enforce such a Chem and Askama on the Seichrim, but they would be Maida because there was a good reason for this Jabila. It wasn't Stama Jabila for whatever, but it was to bring a Chachma Maida, Din Yasir Vahater, not to be Nichshel Nisari Taira. They don't have Mishayir to land, and everyone has a chiyuv to Lahasir Mikshel, and Ladaiti Ha Difa Fil Opinion Shvuyim. I think it was very common in Sephardic communities that they had a Jabila for Opinion Shvuyim. They would tax the Seichrim to create a pidyon shvuyim fund for those who were literally captured by pirates, by other armies. So that was more common. So ladaiti, this is even greater than pidyon shvuyim. Shezeh atzalas gufay v'zeh atzalas neshmasay. Gadol amachtiya yesir min harga. And if pidyon shvuyim, you find the jabila. So for sure, hasadas mikshel b'nei Yisrael, you need a rab marbitz taira. For sure, you need a jabila. So for that reason alone, the jabila was fair. It was right to institute it, and it's right to enforce it. And again, there's more makaitis, more factors. It seems fair to him that this haskama, this cherem, this mas, this jabila was warranted, and it is fair to impose it and to enforce it and to execute it, to carry it out. So again, you'd fully appreciate the back and forth and the chiddush of what he's saying if you were to understand the full context of how things operated. But I think we get the general gist. So this is another makar where the chashivas, the chiyuv of a rab marbitz taira can overcome other tainas that otherwise may have been more of a stronger taina. So Dr. Ovadia Yosef, and you see that he's saying that appointing a rab marbitz is even greater than pinyan shvuyim. Pinyan shvuyim is the greatest. It says in Shulchan Aruch, "Ein mitzvah gedayla yesver pinyan shvuyim." That's what Shulchan Aruch says, and yet Dr. Merva Hollis, hiring a rab is even greater than that. So that's another chashul makar. Another makar is the Chasam Sofer, Charisha Mishpat Siman Kuf Tzadik Zayin. The Chasam Sofer writes to the community. I didn't look up to see which community it was, but maybe we could if we wanted to. He writes to the community. He says, "I want to share this with you. I want to express this to you, and don't ignore what I'm saying." You have to gather and to be mechadish the melucha, lekaba lechem l'reish, v'katzin, rav, toifus yeshiva, tzadik v'niska, v'ashiyiras Hashem hiyo itzaroi, geder geder or ein beferes, just like your ancestors did. A rav machzik yeshiva, this dimension of that the rav has the yeshiva, lumid, l'lamid, lishmer balasos. So this is something some Sefer wrote to community. You can't just remain with the status quo, no rav. And it's another Chasam Sofer that many are mitzayin to Erdechaim Simnei Shvav. Taka shtang sich on the same Shulchan Aruch Erdechaim Nun Gimel that appointing a rav is even more important than a shliach tzibur. And it says in Shulchan Aruch Eisha Mishpat Kosamach Gimel that kofeh b'nei Erzazet to hire a chazan. So if you combine the two Shulchan Aruchs together, come to chois that if kofeh to hire a shliach tzibur, and the Rosh says the Shulchan Aruch brings that a rav is even greater than a shliach tzibur. So kol shekain that kofeh to appoint a rav marbitz taira, and no yachid can be ma'akev. He doesn't have the power. So Kofin, Bnei Ir, Kofin Zazel, Kabal, Leim Rav, and Mamela, they all have to contribute, and no one can say, "Oh, I don't need a Rav, I don't need a Hira." Everyone is forced to contribute. So here you also see the Chasam Sofer getting more into this technical vart that I alluded to earlier. There's this shaila of, is there a chiyuv to appoint a Rav Mahira, and whether you're Kofin. So you see the Chasam Sofer was addressing this, and this was his mahalach to combine these two Shulchan Aruchs together to say that clearly it is a chiyuv and clearly Kofin. And we'll get back to this point a bit later. He also shot Ace and Aryeh, who I believe is already from the 1900s. I think I quoted him before, maybe in Chometz for Pesach. He was expressing that it's very sad. There are Kehilas in Romania that don't have a Rabbanim made it tzedek, and the Torah is Halacha Sumi Daldalas, deteriorating with Arva Bagam Yildu Masayim. And the Shara is that whenever there's a city that has a Rav and the Rav passes away or leaves, they don't replace him. They don't get another Rav. That's the Shara, and that's the Navi is saying. Malko or Malkev, Sarah, Bagayim, and Torah, that they don't have leaders, they don't have Torah. That's Ois Beis and Yabi Aimer. So now in Ois Gimel, now Ovadia Yosef brings it back around to the case at hand. He says, now that we know all this, and we know there are problems in Yerushalayim, the kashrus and the mikvos, and it's a big issue, and the hotels, the kashrus in the hotels is not being taken care of properly. And these problems have cropped up ever since the previous Rabbanim Rashim Yerushalayim passed away. And thousands, tens of thousands of Yidden staying at the hotels are being nichshol, b'avei nesin rabbim in treif. And there's no doubt that if the current candidates whose names go before them, Shom Harich Lifneim, B'tzal Zholti, Mishalom Mashash, here he mentions the names. B'vadai, if they were to be elected, b'vadai, they could have so much to offer, mechachmasam, mirasam, and kashrus, and mekvois, ligder geder, v'lam the parrots. Also interesting that he's focusing more like maritats, less on paskening individual shilas, and even less on being marbitz Torah yeshivas, but focusing on being goiter geder, v'lam the parrots. There are cases where there are systemic Yiddishkeit problems that need real power and real initiative to solve. It's not going to be solved on its own. They can prevent chilul Shabbos for hester that are being done in the many hotels. And yachziru lataros atar liyashna hanabatzas hatayra laharim kan atar v'lem daha. And even though le'alman Yisrael and the Arab and Shchunot and Merit Tzedek and Rosh Yeshivas and Rabbi Tzitayra can yirbu. So it's not like, so as we alluded to before, sometimes you have many chacham. It's not like there's no Torah, but the legal authority to deal with larger kashrus issues, larger issues like this, is only given to the rabbanim rashiyim. They can determine who gets to that kashrut in a hotel, and they can set the standards for what the t'na'ei kashrut are, and relating to that, Shmir Shabbos as well, or to withhold the tu'udah, and there's no replacement to that. There's no replacement to them. And then Ovadia Yosef brings the conversation back around that there are some akairis, there are some shalos shuvas that seem to say that there isn't always a chiyuv, and you're not always kofeh. So here we're starting to hear that there is another side to the issue. And who's that? It says Maharash ben Chason in Shut Beis Shlema. He was asked about a community that doesn't have a rav, and they're considered she'en le'iraya, like the lashon pasuk in this week's Parsha. And Miktas HaKol decided when to hire a rav and a motz. Can they be kofeh on the Miktas HaKol who are opposed? And B'chalal back then also, it's important to emphasize, back then communities were, along with the power that they had, there was also some kind of form and framework for democracy, and major decisions on the part of the kehillah involving money and appointments required the Rosh Kehillah or all the members of the kehillah to gather together and to sign off. So when we talk about kehillas and rabbanim and getting things done and authority, like I mentioned all the way at the beginning, people also forget that there used to be, I don't know if it's fair to say real democracy, but there had to be real buy-in. Today there seems to be an assumption that, rabbanim should just sort of clamp down and grab authority and tell people what to do, and that's not necessarily exactly how things always work. Major decisions, major things that impacted the community often were done with the participation of the community. And then you had the shaila of sometimes whether there's a musag of kofeh. Can we empower a faction in the community to push ahead over the objections of the other part of the community because they have Torah and outside poskim, etc. on their side? So Marash ben Chason said that taka hiring a Talmid Chacham, Gadol, Meira Heroes, etc. would be l'kaved l'teferes l'bnei Eir. But it's not a tzedek gadol kol kach. Le'alman Yisrael, the community has Talmid Chacham and Sifrei poskim. Interesting that I mentioned Sifrei poskim because historically also it's another important factor. I once recorded a whole share on AI and paskening from AI in this era, and I pointed out that B'zman Rishonim, once many chiburim and halacha started being neschaber, you start seeing voices that say that you needed a rav, you needed a Rosh Yeshiva, you needed someone to teach you Torah, or else you wouldn't know. Today, that they imparted their knowledge and their wisdom into Sfarim, so it's possible to be self-taught, and you don't need a rav and a pasuk. So there's also it's also an interesting strain of thought historically, and perhaps it's being alluded to here. You have Talmid Chacham and Sifrei poskim, V'arei Pas, V'arei Basar, V'arei Shulchan Aruch Lefanenu. They have Talmid Chachamim who can be mevin b'sfarim, afishim b'yisura, and lemetzinu chiyuv. If you look literally in the Sfarim, which is also a point I've been alluding to, if you look where it talks about the chiyuv of what the community is mechuyev to get, and the kofeh, it talks about getting Sifrei Torah and Avim Meksuvim. There's no clear halachic marker that says you're chayav to hire a Talmid Chacham. The Afka from Malamed, it says machrimim meseir if they don't have the Tanekah Shel Beis Rabban. So the closest tzushta you could find is this tzushta we saw earlier of chatzar hashutfin, that sometimes the chatzar's needs, the amiyot within the chatzar can force others to install certain things that the chatzar needs. But even there, it depends what. There's some things that are chiyuv that you can be kofeh, and then there's some things that are extras that you don't have to be, that you can't be kofeh. So this Shut Beis Shlema wants to say that hiring a Talmid Chacham Merit Tzedek, that's like the extras. It's Yipui Gadol, Chen V'Karv L'Bnei Eir, but Ein Bei Tzedek Kol Kach. So this is an opposing voice that Ovadia Yosef is finally disclosing here in Eis Gimel. So Dr. Ovadia Yosef, that's in his case, where Taka didn't seem like there was any urgent need. There wasn't a clear void, a clear lack that needed to be addressed. But in the Dan, where there are clear problems, surely he'd be made that your kofeh to appoint the Rabbanim Rashim. So in this case, those who are pro are being kofeh, the members of the Mafdal, etc., who don't want it. So it's also a concept of kofeh. In this case, kofim to allow the process of the election to go forward, and so he would be Maida. And by Ikara Kvartama Agar and Chaim Shmuel Halevi in this tshuva quoted in Shut Kapi Aaron Azriel, Chelik Beis, there's already a response to the Menashe ben Chasson in Beis Shleima. And said to me, Ani Tuva, Rif Chachamase, Ich Kasav Kein, Mitzvahs Minei Shoiftim, is a mitzvah Ksuv B'Torah, and according to some Chachamim, even now, there's no Smuchim, it's still a mitzvah Min HaTorah, the Shechasayo of Dinan, Mitzayin to different Mekayros, and Mari Bel, Mishpte Shmuel, they say, to get a Marbet's Torah is a mitzvah Gedoyla, there could even be Mater Shvuah Das Rab, which we alluded to earlier. And he says there, Muzman Zagan, that Marash ben Chasson, he was Yoshiva Kisahira, Be'ir Gedoyla Shal Chacham V'Shal Seifrim, Shulchan Aruch Lefneim, Bisra Shmina V'Yayin Yashan, and Kol Pnei Megadim. So they added goods. Someone who's full can't relate to the pain of someone who's hungry. So Marash ben Chasson had it good, so he couldn't imagine what the lack feels like, what the lack looks like. But that's the limit chos on him that he would say such a thing. But as I keep alluding to, there's clearly a fault line here. There's clearly something that's not pashut here, which I want to get to later. But in Ovadia Yosef's presentation, he acknowledges that there's this other voice, but that seems to be the odd one out, and even he would be Maida, etc. And he says, Ayin b'seif ha-sefer, maybe Taka Shut Kape Aaron Azriel, or one of the terms he mentioned, in the Haskama of Hagoyin, Rishon L'Tzion, and B'vam Ashkenazi, he was maskim Taka that the Roiv could be kofeh the miut to being a Marbet's Torah layer. So in some cases, there are some who would say that the miut could be kofeh, or at least the Roiv could be kofeh. He says, I already said anyway that even the Beis Shleima would be Maida here, so it's not like we have to push away the Divrei Beis Shleima. I'm sure the Beis Shleima would be Maida that we need Rabbanim Rashim in this case. So V'hamoinea b'chiras and Ovadia Yosef in Safek that he's b'chlal, what the Rambam says in Hilchos Talmud Torah, ha'ma'ak v'serav malasas mitzvah harei chayev nidui. So Ovadia Yosef is bringing out the big guns against those who are delaying the election. And it's also a psak in Shulchan Aruch Yerdei Seven Shalom Adalet. And he says, perhaps those that are pressing you and demanding to stop the process, maybe they don't know the Isser. So I'm writing this tshuva to prove that it's Parsha chiyuv. And I'm encouraging you to finish the whole process. And chazak v'amatz, etc. And then in the Yabi Omer, in the brackets, it says, Omar ha aleph hey, Omar ha kaisev, ha magia, maybe l'dves atfus, I don't know, whatever the hey stands for. Or maybe it's himself, himself, he wrote a postscript. Today Hashem Yisbarach, that what I wrote, also Pedis Pedis, and they went ahead and they did it, and despite all the lachatzim, Shel Sarem Avdal v'Ozrehem, Lafsik et Halichah Bechirot, Bechol Minei Drachim Nelozot, pretty sharp lashon, and calling them Avdal by name, and Nir Tamehem, B'lei Mehamoinam, and Gimel Kislev Tavshalam Ches, they elected B'tzal Jolti, and Shalom Meshash, Labanim Rashim Yerushalayim, and they were Matzliach, also Gedoylus and Etzudas L'Kvoidos Yerushalayim. Another source, that concludes the tshuva of Ovadia Yosef. Like I said, both interesting for the context, for the history, for the parsha, and also interesting to see how he goes through the sugya and how he cites the Mekayros, and towards the end he acknowledges that it's not so pashut, but he's trying to smoothen things out. Another source on this whole parsha is actually a autobiography by Rabbi Gedalia Schreiber himself. I found it in Yitzhak Chachma, a sefer Nahalech B'Rogesh Hashatevis Rabbi Gedalia Schreiber, Pirkei Chaim. He printed it in Tavshinayim Gimel. He was still alive then. And on page 159 to 169, he writes this parsha up from his perspective, his memory. And in the Nispachim, at the end of the sefer, they actually quote a portion of this tshuva in Yabi Omer, because it's a tshuva written to him, so it's negayah to his biography. So it's quoted there, Taka, in the end. So that's interesting parsha. One other pasuk that I saw is the Mishnah Halacha from Menashe Klein, and his tshuva is actually dated earlier. This tshuva is in Mishnah Halacha Chelik Yud Simukov Samach Gimel, but it's dated earlier. It's dated Elul Tavshin Lamed Gimel, and it's entitled Chiyuv L'Kol Kehila Charedis L'Kabel Rav, and it's written to someone whose name is omitted. Doesn't say his name. It says, with regard to your question, there are many from shuls that don't hire a rav and befrat the shtiblach. So Menashe Klein is going to bring this question right back around to our metzias, to the reality we live in, that in Brooklyn and many places, you have a lot of shuls, and some shuls have a rav, and some shuls don't have a rav, or maybe some shuls have a spiritual leader, but not dafka a rav, a pasuk, a aveira. So Menashe Klein addressed this question back in Tafshin Lamed Gimel. Zakir Menashe Klein, I've spoken about this many times. It's a awful gadol. It's a big avla for two reasons. It's number one, he says it's an avla to the Bali Torah. And as we'll see here, this is a sort of a critique of modern yeshivish culture and the modern paradigm and status quo. So he says, every Talmud, that was the dream. The ultimate goal was to be a Meirei and that would give sipuk to the bachrim to learn the whole model was built on that being the goal. That the Yereim don't need Rabbanim. And the more modern shuls, the more modern communities, which presumably still have the model of hiring a rabbi, but the Bnei Torah don't want to go there. They don't want to end up stuck in a place like that. According to Menashe Klein, that sort of upended the whole model of yeshivas, talmidim, Bnei Torah. So second of all, b'chlal, kam yeshivas, they look b'shlila, b'chlal al meirei and on talmidim who want to be meirei. And I'm in a tight choice. He's clearly talking about the standard, the precedent set by Lakewood. And it's Yudua that part of the establishment of Lakewood was changing this paradigm. We know that all the yeshivas in Lita, the goal ultimately still was to be a meirei, and all the hashkafah graduates all were appointed as meirei, and often in small communities, and may have not been fun and geschmack and easy, but that was just sort of the model. You're going to learn Torah, you're going to graduate, you'll get smicha, and you'll become a rav. Or else you're a nobody, or else maybe you wasted your time. Now in the yeshivas, they look at it negative, not just b'chlal, but specifically talmidim that want to be meirei rav. If you're in yeshiva and your focus is, I want to graduate and become a rav, so that's negative. That's a negative for you. People look down on you. But as he says, it's the talmidim and it's the meirei rav themselves. And, you turned out to be a meirei rav. You're a nobody. You didn't make it. You're a loser. That means that you're stama. You didn't succeed in the limud in yeshiva. The real limud in yeshiva is to be a lamden, azoi in the Weltarein. If you're a meirei, you must be a pasha cup. You're not good for a lamdana, so you become a meirei instead. That's what he's alluding to. It's not a secret that's what he means, and was widespread, or maybe still is widespread. Someone who is in yeshiva and wants to learn hira, he's prevented. I know a case that there was one of the mashgichim in a big yeshiva who said in a Musar Shmuz that it's usher to learn Shulchan Aruch Yeridei in yeshiva, and whoever takes a Yeridei off the shelf and learns Yeridei bli rishus, harei oichel gezel bi yeshiva. So which I don't know who it was and whether it happened exactly the way he said it, but it certainly sounds like something that very much could have happened. But to Menashe Klein, that's like topsy-turvy world, that the yeshiva is intimidating you to not learn Hayra, not to learn Yeridei. Very interesting. And then Menashe Klein goes on to quote the Makaitis. We really essentially saw them, so I'll try to say it very quick. He quotes the Torah Yeridei Reish Nun Aleph from the Mechaber there, and Orach Chaim Siman Nun Gimel. It's all based on this rush of the tzibur that needs to hire one, and he's been signed to Chuvas Marish Dam. And Zok Menashe Klein, so we see that even if you don't have a shliach tzibur, and that means, as he is also aware, historically that meant that it wouldn't be able to be yoytze yidei chayvas tefillah, but ulam ipashas advarim nire da'af shela yedu l'spal la'atzim b'yechidos. Not only meaning that's taka the pshat, but meaning he worked it through and said, not only is there not someone who can lead them in tefillah, but that means that they can't daven b'yechidos as well, which Pashtus is taka the pshat, as we saw earlier, Yaakov Emden and others. But still, to have a Rav Meirei Yedin Darkei Hashem is other from tefillah, and Kol Shekain, where they know how to daven, they just don't have a chazan menagin toiv, that Avada, the Rav comes first, and then he quotes the Bir Halacha Taka, Orach Chaim, and he quotes the same Bir Halacha that Ovadia Yosef quoted. Like I said, like a big drasha called Koyra the Chavetz Chaim. You can tell it's a fiery drasha of the Chavetz Chaim. And here he seems to quote the entire thing, Kalashoni, not like a paraphrase and a kitzur like Ovadia Yosef does. And there I see that the Chavetz Chaim, the Mishnah Berurah, says that he mentioned the communities that only have a sheichet. Back then, the sheichet was also Kli Kodesh. So they would have a sheichet that they needed to have, and that was enough for them.
So he says, Sheikh is not enough. So that could be, if you have a Sheikh that's worthy, but you hired him first and foremost as a Sheikh, but he could also do the other stuff, then fine, maybe that's okay. But otherwise, it's not okay. The kol shekain sheyesh seichrim lehem shots before some of the Nagan Gadol. And the Mishnah Berurah refers to the fact that Chazanim were at their peak at the time, and communities were hiring Chazanim. So that they hire, sort of building on the choice that the Rash talks about. So you want to talk about the choice between a Rav and a Shatz? So they're hiring a Shatz, they're hiring a Chazan, and they pay. So Menashe Klein quotes it as be'at kama me'ez dollar. They pay a few $100s. Now, really, in the Makkah and Mishnah Berurah and Bir Halacha, it says ruble kesef. But I guess the Mishnah Halachas figured he'll change it to the American context, a few $100s per year. I don't know if a few $100 per year was still a big salary in the time of Menashe Klein in 1973, but you got the point. And for that price, they could have hired a Rav, and a Matz, and the Shatz. And there wouldn't have been such a fancy chazan, it would have been a more pasha chazan. And surely their tefillah would also be accepted. And now they hire a chazan shel Hashem Shemayim. That's the lashon that's said about tefillah when the tefillah is not done correctly. Nasna lei b'koila against nesia. So if davar, this is all the bir halacha. So if davar, the city goes midachi al dachi, they don't have a murder manig, and they end up with chol shabbos, as the Ovadia Yosef paraphrased and quoted before. And the Menashe Klein quotes this and says, I'm copying everything he said because it's so urgent. We see that there are many shuls that MS they identify we're a shul, we follow the pasuk of the Mishnah Berurah. We're Mishnah Berurah people. You follow the Mishnah Berurah, so why don't you have a aveira? The Mishnah Berurah says in the Mishnah Berurah you should have a aveira, so follow them all the way. And then he quotes the Rambam Hilchos Shuvah that the Mighty Tatztaka quoted about you have to have a Chacham Gadol B'Zaken. So we see from the Rambam this taka a chiyuv. So that's another reason to have a aveira on every shul. And now Menashe Klein clarifies his view. Dina Seinu had a call based medrash, have a call b'fnei atzmai. Back in the day, it was sort of every geographic location, every community was a call. Today we don't have that whole model. So today, Dr. Menashe Klein, every base medrash is its own call, and therefore the Rambam needs a mechiach. We've seen the be'emes kol kehila be'knishta that has a meirahira. So he's talking about the tzibur, b'derech haTorah, miyashim derech Hashem, and their children. Then Dr. Menashe Klein, Shuv Heir Hashem Einai, and I saw Maritza Halon, and here he quotes Roiv, a big section talk of Maritza Halon, Simon Kuflam and Gemon. He says, "Hatak Revat Shuva Kiim Kilein Leinayim," and he signs his name Menashe Hakotten. So very interesting to see how Ovadia Yosef applied it to the Israeli model of Rabbanim Rashiyim, and the problems that they alone are uniquely able to address, that the Rav Shchuna can't address, and the yeshivas can't address, and Rav Menashe Klein addressing it to the American context of the yeshivish, the streak in the yeshivish world, the chiddush of being anti-meirahira, and individual kehillas, every shtibul, every shul, that should essentially be identified as its own kehillah, and whether or not they actually hire a rav or not, and that they really are required to have a rav. And as we saw, really, there are really different dimensions to what role the rav is filling. And as I mentioned earlier, and I'll mention later, today there are those who could taina that why does my shul need to have a rav? We all call Rabbi Pliny, who serves the whole larger local community, so lav dafka the shul needs a rav to answer shilas. However, that itself as a taina needs to be evaluated in every case. Certainly here in Crown Heights, I know from family, those who are involved in the local shuls, that often you do have people that don't feel comfortable going to the major rav. If they knew that their shul's rav answered shilas, they would much prefer to go to him, and they would ask many more shilas. So that is certainly a factor to consider, even when you're going to taina there is a larger local rav serving the larger community. And in addition, as we saw, there's also the teaching the Torah. And there's also the inyan of being oimid beperetz, to be madrich the community, to set them straight. And these are all potential factors here at play. And dafka that Rambam that is quoted is focusing more on being a mechiach. So that summarizes the portion of our discussion, focusing on this Maharitatz, who based himself on this pasuk in this week's Parsha, and tired that it's ke'over, kemad over belav. This Maharitatz, is at this point now, having searched for it, I came across it directly in the Maritats, but then I went and searched, and I saw that it's not quoted in a nice amount of Sfarim printed in the last few decades. It's possible that a number of them saw it via the Ovadia, who was very influential. But like I said, at any rate, it was only printed very recently. I'm actually a bit confused on the exact timeline, because the Sefer was officially printed in Tafshin Mem, but yet Ovadia Yosef writing in Tafshin Lamed Zayin, Lamed Ches, and Menashe Klein in Tafshin Lamed Gimel, so it's not fully clear to me what exactly is going on there. I also saw that the Sefer Eved HaMelech, Reb Shmuel Umener, seems to quote this Maritat Chadashos towards the end, so the timeline here is a bit confusing. The word shuvas from the Maritat Chadashos that were printed earlier, so maybe that's what happened here. Maybe it was already printed, like I said earlier, Meir Ben Ayahu seemed to print parts of it already back in Tafshin Yud Aleph, so maybe it was printed earlier than Tafshin Mem. But I am a little unclear on when this tshuva was actually printed and publicized for the first time. But it's somewhere between Tafshin Yud and Tafshin Mem, and not earlier. So it is quoted in a number of Sfarim. It's not completely unknown and obscure today. One sefer that I saw that quotes it, and I always like to find interesting Sfarim that if you say they're Parsha, so I found the Netzar Chachman is a sefer Halacha Psuka Parsha, and for every Parsha it takes halachic topics and just quotes a bunch of direct quotes from the Sfarim. Interesting format, interesting concept for a sefer. So I saw that there's a section there on this week's Parsha, page Shin and Gimel through Shin and Ches, and they quote the Maritats there. Another place where I saw these Makaris being quoted and a nice overview is in a sefer, sort of a journal sefer called Barkai, Volume 4, Tafshin Pei Beis, page 92 through page 101. This is a topic, obviously, that people are constantly interested in and Sfarim write about. And so a nice number of them, whether they're Sfarim focusing on the Halacha or just Sfarim on the Parsha, the Maritats is not completely unknown.